Let me begin by thanking all of you and thanking Rick for the invitation to speak here. This is my first time in St. Paul, Minnesota. I've been to Minneapolis before, and it's nice to see the city that you brought to us, right? Because all of the people that you've mentioned, all of the brands that are here, but you're the man that connected those two things. And so I've watched you, heard you. I actually have seen all of those people here from afar. And so the work that you do tirelessly for the last 25 years is something that I cannot say anyone else is doing in this country. Wow. So thank you. I also want to say that I've been delighted to follow your shadow for the last 2 days, because anywhere we go, we get the best seat, the best parking. You know everybody in town, so this guy is the man, and I'm just honored to be here. Thank you. So Rick asked me to speak before you on a book that I published about 6 months ago. I spent half of the pandemic writing it. And so that was my pivot. We all had to do something different during the pandemic. And so I had started thinking about this book that I, interestingly, had a different title for. And when I mentioned the title to a couple of colleagues, that title ended up on LinkedIn a couple of times. And I said, bastards, how can you do that? So the theme of the book never changed, right? The theme of the book is the big shift. And all of us here in this room are advocates for the Hispanic or the Latino community. That's a given. The question that corporate America is suffering and answering is, how do we make them win with this consumer? And so to me, after 30 years in this business, after 8 years in academia, I think that there's a nice sweet spot, and we've got to be really agnostic about what we tell corporations. It's not about and there isn't one way. There are many ways of winning. It really depends on the kind of consumer and the kind of client or category you're in. And so to me, this is more about a contingency plan that really is rooted around a framework, okay? And so let me talk to you about, I've got about 20 slides here. I left a lot of time for Q&A, okay? So I want to kind of hear your thoughts and your questions around the topic at hand. The question that I pose here is, are you market driven or driving the market? Are you following the rules, or are you leading the category, challenging the status quo? That to me is the difference between someone who's going to lead versus follow. And I spent many years talking to leading companies. All the companies that you had up there are leading organizations who invest, who are committed, who fail, who continue to fail, and then they succeed. But there are a lot more followers than leaders, and then there are a lot more laggards than followers and leaders. So there's a lot of work, right? So Luis Fitch is here on the creative side. There's many other folks here that are interested in helping clients navigate this journey. But there's differences within organizations. The premise of the book is really simple. We talk about Hispanics and Hispanic marketing by reaching them in Spanish and in culture. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's the silo. That's how we actually came to be about. If it were not for Univision and Telemundo back in the 90s, we wouldn't be here. Because the market was here, but they aggregated the market. They put us on the map because the money came. And all of a sudden, the boundaries around this paradigm began to be formed. But 30 years later, we continue to talk about the foreign-born or the Hispanic market in aggregate. And in this room, much like out there, there's a lot of diversity within the Hispanic population, right? So Rick and I are Latinos, but we're very different. Mexican family, Spanish family. Wife's Cuban, wife's Mexican, right? You've been here, you live here, I live on the west side, the west coast. And so I got here when I was 8. And so we have differences, but we're still united and connected by some very similar, some values, right? What I'm proposing is that we right-size the silo and we elevate and integrate Latinos in mainstream marketing. So when you look at Los Angeles and some of these cities, it is multicultural America. right? And so we talk about Hispanic in the silo. I'm talking about Hispanics in mainstream marketing, in the new mainstream. And I'm asking companies to think about that and elevate the role that we play in mainstream marketing. Okay, so I'm going to talk about five themes. I have 5 themes that will kind of encapsulate the book as best as I can. And so I feel like the marketing industry is going through an inflection point. That was sort of like a big category, big global sort of trend. And I'm thinking the state of marketing has to change. Because 30, 40 years ago, we were like focused on television, we were focused on language, and all of a sudden we have digital, we have social, we have mobile, we have all of these different things that we can hyper-local, target at a hyper-local level. We can do a lot of different things that we didn't do before. And so from a media perspective, from a technology perspective, things have changed. But we continue to define Hispanic the same way, which is kind of odd, because the general market doesn't talk about the population in aggregate. They're talking about millennials, they're talking about Gen Zers. There's always these segments within their population. And so why are we aggregating ourselves? And why are we limiting ourselves to this small silo? The foreign-born Hispanic population in this country is 1/3 of the total Hispanic pop. 65% is US born. English first, bilingual, bicultural, et cetera. And so what I'm saying is, if companies don't make a change, the market will change them. And this inflection point, maybe it's conceptual, but they've got to make the change now because the demographic changes are real and they're taking place at this moment. So to speak about the demography isn't enough. The fundamental issue in my mind and the key problem here is that companies continue to see marketing in a silo. They see multicultural marketing in a silo. So we got a team, we got 5 people, check. But marketing, it's not multicultural marketing, it's marketing in a multicultural America. That's the change. That's the shift. That's the reframing that we've got to make. Many companies also don't see this as a growth opportunity. This is not about checking the box. What are we doing about the Hispanic market? What plans do we have in language? We met with a client yesterday who asked us, well, I'm actually translating this, and I'm like, before you do the translation, let's step back and think about your strategy before we start to execute and waste money, which then drives your ROI down. So if you don't see it as a growth opportunity, step back and let's talk, right? And let's also not define Hispanic marketing by the language that you're communicating your consumer. Because many of you, if not all of you, are communicating on social media in English. You're 100% Latino. You're 100% American. At home, you're probably speaking Spanish to some degree with family members and friends. At work and in here, we're in English. That's just the way it is. And so we've got to sort of understand, when in-language marketing works and matters. So, demographic changes are significant, and we know that we're moving towards a multicultural America in 25 years. That's a given. No matter what happens, if there's another election with Donald Trump, if immigration slows down, if the wall goes up, it doesn't matter. It'll slow down, it'll go up. There's always variations to immigration. The problem is that America, the white America, is declining on a daily basis. The growth population of whites in St. Paul in the last 10 years was -7%. You have a declining white population. That means you have less white customers buying products. Hispanics are up 16% during the same time frame. Same thing with African American and Asian. So you're now having growth, you're seeing population growth through the multicultural segments. That's just the shift in the demography that we're seeing. Okay? And so we talk about these demographic changes at a high level. I'm proposing that we look at things by market, because brands win or lose share at the hyperlocal level within the DMA, right? So if I'm selling cars, I'm tracking cars in Los Angeles and I'm saying, okay, well, do I have 30% share, right? Or do I have 50% share? We know LA is the majority of Los Angeles is Hispanic. So I need to kind of understand what my sales are relative to the population base within these cities, not at the national level. So it's nice to know about 2020, 2045, but what I really care about is, am I winning in these markets that are increasingly being multicultural? Chicago is 30% Latino, 30% African American, 30% white. It's just, you know, the majority of Los Angeles is multicultural. New York, 68%. Multicultural America is here. Okay? And so I want to reframe the conversation. And there's nothing new here. Clients understand this, but they still talk about what I hear. I think it's rhetorical, because it really doesn't matter if it's 2020, 2045 or 2050 or 2030. Because right now, the markets are multicultural, and you've got to do something about it. So point number 3, Spanish has traditionally defined Hispanic marketing. So I left the business the month before 9/11 took place. And then the market went cold. I decided to pivot, and I went into a doctoral program. And during those 8 years, I came out very different. My thinking patterns were different. I began to question everything. I was advised and recommended to not play it safe. That was the best advice I ever got, to never play it safe. And because I didn't play it safe, I started questioning the language model. And I started thinking about what other variables could I develop or could we use to drive ROI or to do a better job in targeting Hispanics. And so while the market is using language to define Hispanics and really shape your mental model around marketing to Hispanics, there's other variables out there that have lived in the shadows of language. One of which is nativity, where you're born. So a US born and a foreign born are very different consumers. Okay? So I won't get into all of the dimensions, but if we just look at language spoken at home, and we look at 3 generational levels, like immigrants or the foreign born, second and third generation are both US born. So 60% of the immigrant or the foreign born speak only Spanish or more Spanish than English. On the other hand, 60 to 90% of the US born are what we call English dominant. They speak only English and more English than Spanish. So as generational levels increase, your proficiency of Spanish decreases, your familiarity with Spanish declines, and so by the time you're a third gen, right, 60% are speaking only English at home. 30% are speaking more English than Spanish. And so these nuances that we're talking about are important. So the disaggregation of these consumers is important. And this right here drives ROI. And so we started thinking about the power of nativity as a better predictor than language, right? And so what we said was, okay, if that's the case, then let's look at Nielsen ratings. In Nielsen ratings, they track an aggregated audience, so you can look at Hispanic adults, or you can look at Hispanic adults, foreign-born, US-born. The differences are significant. The majority of the viewership on Univision and Telemundo are your foreign-born. There's a small percentage of US-born, but it mirrors the language use at home data that I just showed you. So when you look at that data, you look at the Nielsen data, then you're like, okay, well, how much are clients spending in reaching Latinos? And so what we found is that the majority of the millennial audience is not on Univision and Telemundo, which is the core audience or consumer for corporate America. We found that up to 80%, and really 78, 79, 80% of spend does not reach Latinos on Spanish language. So that begs a big question on the shift. If they're not on linear television on Spanish, then where are they? Where's the digital? Digital, social, mobile. That's where they are. They're young. The median age for a U.S. born is 19. The median age for a U.S. born, the median age for a foreign born is 38, 39. The median age for a U.S. born is 19. Very different. When you aggregate, you talk about 28, 29, obviously younger than the general market, but those differences, again, matter. So, U.S. marketing continues to be siloed. I'm here to tell you, let's blow up the silo, or let's just be less, less aggressive and say, let's just, right-size the silo, because the silo worked at the in the beginning, and we don't need to pigeonhole ourselves. Is that the word? Pigeonhole. We don't need to silo ourselves from mainstream. I don't want $3. I want the $3,000. I want the $3 million. I want the $300 million. And I'm part of Los Angeles. I'm not this little silo over here, right? And so part of what I needed to do was to understand where marketing is going. And I think the answer to that could be socially constructed. In other words, it's in my hands really to where we want to go. But the market has chosen that language and insights are the two things that drive strategy for brands, right, in this space. So I did a 2x2 matrix, 4 quadrants. Bottom left, we're talking about translations, the sort of strategy that we were hearing yesterday from a client. It's in language, it's in Spanish, and I'm using general market insights. So I'm just translating. So I'm basically communicating that insight that general market works for these consumers. That is maybe 1980s, 1990s. So there are, again, leaders, followers, laggards. Quadrant 2, you're creative adapting. So you're now doing things in Spanish, and you're doing things with Hispanic insights, right? But that's still very it's still unstrategic. The piece that we're missing here is really quadrant 4. It's not Hispanic marketing, but it's marketing in a multicultural America for Hispanics. It's looking at English with a multicultural insight, or an insight that reaches the mainstream, and because the mainstream is the majority of it is Hispanic and African American, those insights can no longer be driven or rooted in non-Hispanic whites, which is what happens in most of these agencies. They're still thinking about the mainstream as white, or they develop, insights, or they recruit, sample, but it doesn't represent the multicultural consumer, so their strategies are still rooted in, 2000s or whatever, something in the past. So we need to make these fundamental shifts. Again, the word big shift, I know there's 12, 15 books on Amazon called The Big Shift, but you know what? Everything that I kept talking about, is about the shift. It's about the shift. And so we need to help clients understand how to make these shifts. And so there's the easy piece. The easy piece is this stuff. The stuff that you can't, you either believe Nielsen or you don't. You either believe the census or you don't, right? You believe in God? Okay, so then we're on the same page. If you don't, conversation ended, right? And so the challenge here for companies is how to change within these organizations. So a third of my book is about organizational change, and I think this idea of core competencies leading to core rigidities is really interesting. So, but what I mean by that is companies spend years, if not decades, building core competencies to compete effectively, to beat the competition. But what happens is they spend so much time building these competencies, they become rigid to the changing, dynamic marketplace. And so what we need to do is build an organization that's a little bit less rigid. And I wrote a paper talking about asking the rhetorical question, is corporate America ready for a multicultural America? That's kind of like why I wrote the book, because the answer to that for me was no. Corporate America is not ready for a multicultural America. And believe me, I'd rather be home with my kids, walking my dog, reading, writing, and enjoying the sunny LA life than traveling, living in a hotel, and losing a little sleep. So for me, coming here with a message that I think is important is everything. And I don't think corporate America is ready organizationally. All of this noise that we're hearing around DE&I is a part of what we're talking about. It is their wake-up call to say, our companies are not reflecting the landscape. How they do it is a different issue. And so what I wanted to do, and I wrote a paper about this, I said, we need to measure to what degree these companies are really aligned with a multicultural marketplace from a marketing perspective. And so we knew that marketing capabilities and having a market orientation drives performance. In other words, if I'm measuring the competition, I'm market oriented. If I know what's happening out there, I'm marketing oriented. And so I've got questions that I want to ask you in corporate America in finding out how well are you measuring this external environment with black and brown at the forefront. If you're saying, no, I don't track competitive spending, I don't track competition, I don't know what sales are in these places for these consumers, you get minus points. So you're not ready. So if you tell me that you are, you get plus and you get a bigger score. The marketing capabilities now is, how much innovation is really driven by Hispanic or black? Clorox does great work in that. That's why they're kicking ass. Because 10 years ago, they saw that innovation was driven by scent and by hygiene and having clean homes and health and seeing that connection. And guess who's driving that? Guess who's cleaning homes like every other day and having a deep clean? Latinas. Please. And the whole lavender scent comes from African American, which tested really well with Hispanic. I was there. Right? So these insights are driven by these multicultural consumers, and it's not a silo. They're making money because they're seeing it as a mainstream trend. And they're not selling it in La Bodega, but they're selling it everywhere. Right? So the question really is, are you market driven, driving the market? And to me, the question is, well, how do you do that? Well, it's kind of fundamental. And I'll tell you what I thought about when I finished the book, but it's fundamental in the sense that you go from being reactive to proactive and making incremental change. And so you want to disrupt, you want to respond, you want to find value in targeting these consumers. You're not going to do anything, you're not going to convince corporate America anything unless you can quantify the value. This is not about, the demographic piece of it. The demographic piece is just the beginning. It's the how that's really important. And so to me, and I was at a conference, I think 2 weeks ago in Los Angeles called SampleCon, and we were talking among ourselves, we were in the research industry. 90% of these companies do not have sample, right? Sample companies, when you're doing research, you have to buy sample. So these sample companies like Dynata, and you can name them all, Protégé, they have millions of consumers, but the millions of consumers they have are white. And so they're 90% white, they're 81% white when the population of whites is 60 or 61. So they're really behind the 8 ball. I've had conversations at the highest level with every single company in research, and it comes back to the title of this presentation. The market wants what I'm providing. And I'm saying, fantastic, but at one point, you have to take the lead because you're gonna find yourself, 5 cars behind the leader. And this is where we are. And so I don't mind being the bad guy. I'm independent. I don't have a boss that tells me you can't say that. And I think the message is positive. You know what I mean? So, and if they don't want to change, I'll change it for you, because that's exactly what's happened. So in the last 5 years, I've made a lot of friends, but I've also lost a lot of colleagues because they didn't want to embrace this shift publicly because they're monetizing on the language marketing piece, or they don't want to admit that they're in that silo monetizing. And many of them are like, 65, 70. I'm a spring chicken. So I'm not a pioneer, but I'm but I'm not a so the market's going to change, but we need to make the market that's going to listen is the general market, because they're the ones with control. They've got the budgets and they've got the relationships with corporations. I'm not saying my colleagues don't, but corporate America has put them in a silo. And I'm not saying that's the right or wrong thing, but it is what it is. So I'm speaking on the behalf of everyone that we need to make this shift strategically and even operationally. And the idea of language, we need to just, for Univision and Telemundo, that makes sense. It's their model. But it's not your model. You should be customer agnostic. You should be looking at who's your customer and not define the Hispanic consumer by language. If I go to El Mercado, I know exactly the target that I know exactly the language that I'm going to go in there speaking, right? And I know exactly the cultural framework or frame of mind that I need to have going in and going out. The other piece that's going to change fundamentally is also the way and what we track in research and in behavioral marketing. So instead of targeting demographically, we're going to be targeting behaviorally. And so if I want to go after moms who have kids who want the best for their children, who are health oriented, I don't know that ethnicity and race matters that much. Because so I'm looking at I'm looking at a very high, smaller piece of the pie who are unified by behavior rather than demographics. So I'm not looking at it like, here's my black effort, my Hispanic effort. I'm looking at like, okay, I'm going after moms, help me find this behavioral target. And that's where the market's going. And so I want to underscore, so no one misunderstands me, that that race and ethnicity matter, much like gender matters and age matters. But from an ROI standpoint, I actually want to reach the person that's been eating a box of, Oreos a week. So I can make you eat a second box and know that you're the mom that, finds herself happy when she, gives her kids a little galletita in the afternoon after school. So it makes sense to go after the high volume user of your product before I go after someone that is a non-user. So we can even get more sophisticated to drive ROI. And there's a lot more work in this area, and it's moving pretty quickly. And so what I want to do is inject myself into this conversation, into this thread, because multicultural is the mainstream. So don't silo me and don't make your panel all white, because that won't make a difference to you. Because now you're using a strategy, again, you're developing strategies against a target that no longer reflects the multicultural consumer or the mainstream. So the question here before you is, are you ready to make the big shift? And I think if my argument is convincing enough, maybe you are. Thank you very much.
I have a question for you. Yesterday we had a meeting. I'm not going to tell you the name of the client, but it was an amazing story, really. Here was a client, the 14th largest corporation in the world, who in 2004 approached our company to be involved in recruiting a multicultural team, if you will, to go out and reach the Asian, African American, Latino community. And we put together I thought a great team. It was an awesome team. And I thought the product that they represent is so important to Latinos, so important. And yet, it's the patience that these corporations have is very short. They want that ROI right away. That's one thing I think we can all say, that there's not a lot of patience in corporate America if they're spending some dollars. So 4 years of working that marketing team together, and it went away. They dropped it one day. Millions of dollars worth. We met with them yesterday. They're still the 14th largest corporation in the world. They're still selling the product. But now they're gonna try a different method that I thought, you and I spoke after, is that gonna be effective? It didn't sound like it. What happens to us in that translation of a corporation out there that failed, and many of them do? I mean, you could write a book on corporations that have given up on reaching Latinos, and the budgets went this, or they disappeared. We could look around our cities. General Mills, what happened to Rudy Rodriguez? A genius in the business. He was let go. A genius. So how do we, what would be our answer, because they want to talk to us again? What would be our answer to that corporation, Jake?
So I think we've got to become experts in the finance side of it, because I think that's what we need to redo. Because ROI is a calculation, and so we need to understand what goes into those calculations. They're not going to change because they're pressured on a quarterly basis to meet those numbers, and the less risk I inject into that model, the better. So if I don't know, if it's uncertain, and the reason why they dive in and they stick their toe in the water for 2 years, and it's just incremental growth, is because they're not really like counting on it for growth. And so once we actually can say, look, let me help you develop or craft or recalculate your growth based on a multicultural population, because we're looking at the mainstream this way, not this way. And so once we actually have the right calculation based on this multicultural population or consumer base, I think the growth numbers demographically, as you're saying, there's more of these. And so we've got to think about so companies that have done that, like Clorox, I can tell you firsthand, and Procter and Pepsi have done that as well, are not just leaders, but they're category leaders and category disruptors. And then the second piece that I think is missing is this notion of marketing equates to communication. And I think you've got to develop something that's innovative. So I think innovation is part of growth, and I think that is to me, part and parcel with multicultural growth in this country. So I think it's product plus calculating the ROI.
Well, because I look at our audience here and I see, for instance, radio. Maya Santamaria, a great example. Radio is powerful marketing tool in the Latino community. We all know that. I mean, there is radio has faded in some communities, but not in Latino. How would we convince that corporation to say, that's who you want to use? That's who, because I think we could be honest. I mean, I think you would want more major corporations advertising on your radio, of course. And yet there's a hesitancy. You got all the, maybe you want to answer that, Maya. Maybe, why don't you give Maya just a second there. Right. And and you have the numbers, you have the data that shows you have all these listeners, and yet there's a lack of confidence on corporate America's part, on politicians, on people who are spending millions trying to reach communities. They say, well, I don't know about radio. What do you think of that as we move along with your business?
I think that most of the people that are looking at it from that perspective are white. And so it's talking to a person who isn't converted because they don't really understand the community. Just like the doctor said, there are portions that are bilingual in our community, and there are portions that just want to consume Spanish language media, and then you get the people that toggle back and forth. And it's important to understand that if you're not doing both of those things, if you're not working with the English dominant and the Spanish dominant, then you're not really reaching out to the entire community. The corporations understand that, but do they want to put their money behind it? I think a lot of them think, well, as long as we're on, CBS and ABC, we're getting the Latinos. And you're getting some, but you're not getting the guys that are watching, the telenovelas or listening to La Raza. And you have to reach out to that community, because guess what? That's mom and dad, and the kids are listening. It's intergenerational households. They're watching Telemundo because, you know, mom wants to watch that, grandma wants to watch that, and guess what? That's what the whole house is gonna watch. So, and it goes back to also knowing how to transform your brand into a digital age, and that's what we're doing. We're, you know, in our digital life, what we're doing to the community, we're reaching out bilingually. And that's the key.
There's,
questions?
Yeah.
sure.
So first of all, Jay, thank you so much.
Welcome. Thank you.
The key word, disruptive.
Yeah.
I think what most people, and particularly here in Minnesota, have not realized is that corporations are now embracing disruptive conduct. And if you're going to be, I'm an artist, so I'm the worst business in the world because I'm concept, design, financing, and execution. And in the time that I've been here, since '88, it's been a real tough struggle because I don't paint Mexico, I don't paint pyramids, I don't do those things. Yet, recently, my art now hangs at 3M corporate headquarters in the Innovation Center. Most of us can't get there. So if I tell you, hey, Luis, you gotta go see it, you can't get there. But the key is how those opportunities happen is by being the disruptive guy in Minnesota. I'm the one who's notorious for painting for nothing, which every other artist is like, you're crazy, Longoria. Crazy like a fox, because what it is when the corporations look for somebody in the creative field, they come to the one crazy guy in Minnesota. The other thing is the Timberwolves found me. And they said, hey, can you do a t-shirt? I said, I'm not a graphic artist. They said, but you're this guy. And so they did a t-shirt. You can buy it for $45. The Timberwolves will thank you. I will thank you. And the next generation of Latinos will thank you, because if you don't support the consumption, the Timberwolves won't. And cross your fingers. It may become a Latino team in the sense of ownership. When that happens, make a run at it. But I think we have to change our behavior, Rick. We have to be prepared to be disruptive.
Keep it on going.